sweet like a buttercup. You're a Barbie doll. Show them all what I'm made of. Strut down the hall. Won't stop till I get enough.
All right, so you're ready to like really dive into this whole Israel-Hamas ceasefire thing?
Yeah.
It's huge, right?
It is.
Over a year of conflict, and we've got this humanitarian crisis going on in Gaza, and now suddenly there's this like potential turning point.
Right.
So we've got a CBS News report that like lays out all the details. We've got these incredible quotes from people who are actually living in Gaza and are Artsmani, even like a little bit of a glimpse into how the rest of the world is reacting to this whole thing. So let's break it all down.
Yeah, sounds good.
So the agreement was announced yesterday, January 15th, 2025. And the goal is to bring about a ceasefire, get those hostages released, and like open the door for humanitarian aid to finally get in there. And eventually even allow Palestinian families to go back to the areas that they had to flee from.
Yeah.
A big deal. And it took the U.S., Egypt, and Qatar to like all work together to broker this thing.
Yeah, what's really striking to me is how this kind of echoes a proposal that President Biden put forward way back in May of 2024.
Oh, really?
Yeah, to see a similar plan come back around, even after like a whole year of really intense fighting and like failed talks and everything, it really shows you just how much like behind the scenes diplomatic effort has been going on.
That's a good point. Yeah, it's not like they just suddenly came up with this.
Right.
Seems like this has been in the works for a while.
Yeah, definitely.
And CBS News actually got a look at like the draft plan, and Biden's been speaking publicly about it too.
Yeah.
So we've got a pretty clear picture of how this whole thing is supposed to play out.
Yeah, for sure.
So phase one is all about like taking immediate action. The deal says they have to release 33 women and children hostages and anyone over 50 in exchange for Palestinian prisoners that are being held by Israel. And then after that, the Israeli forces would pull back from populated areas in Gaza, which would hopefully lead to a complete ceasefire. And then if that holds, then aid can finally get in and they can start rebuilding.
Yeah, which is a huge undertaking.
Oh, absolutely. It's like starting from scratch in some places.
Right, exactly.
But getting to phase two, like all hinges on that prisoner exchange going smoothly. And I can only imagine how tense that whole process must be.
Oh, yeah, incredibly tense.
Because that's when all the remaining Israeli hostages would be released.
Yeah.
And the Israeli Defense Forces would completely withdraw from Gaza.
Right. It's a big step.
Yeah, huge.
Yeah.
And then finally, phase three is all about like dealing with the aftermath of everything, exchanging the bodies of the people who died on both sides.
Yeah.
And beginning the real work of rebuilding Gaza.
Right.
It all sounds good on paper, but what I find really interesting is how are people who are actually living in Gaza reacting to all of this?
Yeah.
They're expressing this incredible sense of like relief and joy.
Yeah.
And that's happening even as airstrikes are still going on.
Yeah, it's wild.
Yeah, it's just unbelievable. CBS quoted this young woman, and she was saying how happy she is after 15 months of just tears and loss. And there's another quote from an older man who says that he feels like God is sending them hope. You can just feel this this deep yearning for peace in their words. It's a really powerful reminder of like the human cost of this entire conflict.
Absolutely. And you also have to consider like the perspective of the hostage families too.
Right.
In their statement, they express relief and gratitude for the deal. But you can also sense this like underlying acknowledgement of how much their loved ones have suffered. It's a really complicated mix of emotions.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember that some Americans were among those hostages.
Yeah.
And they're supposed to be released in that first phase.
Okay. I can't even imagine what that roller coaster of emotions must feel like.
No, it's unimaginable.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about the political side of this whole thing.
Yeah.
It's not every day that you see a president and a president-elect, especially from opposing parties working so closely together.
Right. It's definitely unusual, especially when you're talking about a transition of power like we have right now.
Right.
You've got President Biden and President-elect Trump, and then all of their envoys, too, all playing a role in these negotiations.
That's wild. And then on top of that, you have Trump taking to social media and claiming that this whole deal is like a direct result of him winning the election.
Right.
And meanwhile, the Biden administration is like downplaying the whole who gets credit thing.
Yeah.
And emphasizing how this was a collaborative effort.
Yeah.
It really makes you wonder if this kind of cooperation, this like unusual cooperation, is going to continue after the inauguration.
Yeah, it's a good question. And we can't forget about the domestic pressure that both sides are facing, too.
Right.
There have been those rallies in Israel with families of the hostages demanding their return. But then you have this tragic reality that some of the hostages may have actually died during their captivity,
Right.
which just adds another layer of complexity to this already super delicate situation.
Absolutely. It seems like this agreement, while it does offer some hope,
Yeah.
it's also stepping into this minefield of potential problems.
Right.
There's so much mistrust
Right.
between Israel and Hamas.
Yeah.
And we've seen ceasefires fall apart before.
Exactly. We have to remember the history here. There have been so many broken ceasefires in the past. The real challenge is going to be making this deal stick, actually implementing it and making sure it holds.
That's a great point. It's easy to get swept up in the optimism of the moment,
Right.
but the reality on the ground is still really difficult.
Yeah, it is.
We're talking about massive casualties. Over 46,000 Palestinians killed in Gaza, around 1,200 Israelis killed, and this huge humanitarian crisis unfolding.
Yeah.
Most of Gaza's population has been displaced. They're living in camps. There are serious concerns about famine. And just getting aid into Gaza has been this constant struggle. The ceasefire just feels like the very beginning of a really long road ahead.
It does. This deal has the potential to finally break this cycle of violence. But there are so many factors at play. If we look back at the history of this conflict, a really big question emerges. Can this actually be the foundation for a lasting peace? Or is this just going to be another temporary pause in the fighting?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think to really understand that, we need to look beyond just the terms of this deal and dig into the deeper issues that are really at play here.
Yeah, it really is the question, isn't it? I mean, this deal, it offers a glimmer of hope, right?
Right.
But can it really break the cycle of violence that we've seen in the region for, decades, right? To answer that, we have to go deeper, right? Beyond just the headlines, we need to look at these underlying issues, the historical context, and like all the potential pitfalls that are kind of lurking out there.
Okay, so what are some of those specific issues that you think could derail this whole fragile peace?
Well, one major hurdle is just this deep-seated mistrust between the two sides. You know, decades of conflict.
Right.
Broken promises, escalating violence, it's all just eroded any sense of trust that might have been there.
Right.
And rebuilding that trust,
Yeah.
it's going to be a huge uphill battle.
And I imagine there are groups on both sides who just reject any kind of compromise at all.
Exactly.
They probably view this deal as a betrayal.
Absolutely. They're what we call spoilers.
Spoilers.
And they can be incredibly powerful forces working to, sabotage the peace agreement from within.
Wow.
Think back to the Oslo Accords in the 90s.
Yeah.
You had factions on both the Israeli and Palestinian sides that were actively undermining the peace process.
Wow. And that ultimately led to its collapse.
Yeah.
So how do you prevent that from happening this time around?
Well, it takes strong leadership on both sides, leaders who are willing to take risks politically and stand up to those hardliners, the people who just want to keep fighting.
Right.
It also requires a sustained commitment from the international community, to hold both sides accountable and to provide the support that's needed for peace-building initiatives.
Yeah, I get that. But even with the best intentions, there are some fundamental issues that just seem almost impossible to resolve. Like the status of Jerusalem, for example.
Yeah.
That's been a point of contention for decades.
Absolutely. It's one of the most sensitive issues in the entire conflict.
Yeah.
Both Israelis and Palestinians claim Jerusalem as their capital,
Right.
and neither side seems willing to compromise.
So how do you even begin to address that?
It's a monumental challenge, right?
Yeah.
You have to find a solution that satisfies both parties.
Right.
One that ensures access to holy sites for everyone, and that respects the historical and cultural significance of the city for both groups.
It's such a layered issue.
Yeah.
And then there's the whole question of Palestinian statehood,
Yeah.
which has been a sticking point for years.
Right. Establishing an independent Palestinian state has been a central demand of the Palestinian leadership.
Yeah.
But it raises so many questions.
Like what?
Borders, security arrangements,
Oh,
the right of return for Palestinian refugees.
right.
These are all incredibly complex issues with no easy answers.
Yeah, it sounds like this ceasefire agreement, while it is significant,
Yeah.
it's just the first step on a very long and uncertain road.
It is. You're absolutely right. This is a process, not an event.
Right.
Even if this specific agreement holds, the underlying issues are still going to be there.
Right.
And addressing those in a way that brings lasting peace, true peace,
Yeah.
it's going to require sustained effort, political will, and I think maybe most importantly, a shift in mindset on both sides.
Okay, so we've talked about the potential problems.
Yeah.
the historical context, the challenges of rebuilding. But I want to shift gears for a minute and think about this from the perspective of just the average person. Like, why should someone listening to this care about what's happening in a place that might feel really far removed from their own life?
That's a great question. And I think the answer is pretty multi-layered.
Okay.
Firstly, this conflict has global implications.
How so?
Well, it impacts regional stability, it influences international relations,
Okay.
and it can even fuel extremist ideologies.
Oh, wow.
What happens in Israel and Gaza?
Yeah.
It doesn't stay confined to those borders.
Right. So on a practical level, it could affect global security, international relations. But I'm also curious about the moral implications.
Yeah, absolutely. This conflict raises some fundamental questions about human rights, about justice,
Yeah.
about our collective responsibility to prevent suffering and to protect the vulnerable.
Those are big questions.
They are. It
Yeah.
forces us to confront our own values and beliefs.
Yeah, I see that. It's a reminder that we're all interconnected in a way.
Yeah.
Even events that seem really far away
Right.
can have ripple effects that are felt across the globe.
Exactly. And it highlights how important it is to stay informed,
Yeah.
to engage in thoughtful dialogue,
Right.
to seek out diverse perspectives,
Yeah.
and to challenge our own assumptions.
That's a great point. It's easy to get overwhelmed by all the complexities of this conflict,
Oh, yeah.
to feel powerless in the face of so much suffering.
Absolutely.
But like you said, staying informed, engaging in meaningful conversations, that's a crucial first step.
It is. And it's also a reminder that peace is not a passive state.
What do you mean?
It doesn't just happen on its own.
Right.
It's something that we have to actively create.
Okay.
It takes effort, it takes commitment, and it takes a willingness to challenge the status quo.
I think that's a really powerful message.
Yeah.
But before we wrap up this whole deep dive, I want to go back to one point you made earlier about rebuilding Gaza.
Yeah.
Such a massive undertaking. And I wonder if you could talk a bit more about what that process might actually look like.
Yeah, that's a really important question. It's something that I think deserves a lot more attention than it usually gets. It's easy to just focus on the immediate needs, the humanitarian aid, the shelters, the basics.
Right, of course.
But to really build a sustainable future for Gaza, we have to think bigger. We have to be more strategic. We have to break this cycle of dependence that's trapped them for so long.
So it's not just about rebuilding what was destroyed. It's about creating something entirely new.
Exactly. Imagine a Gaza that's not reliant on international aid. A Gaza with a thriving economy, where people have real opportunities.
It sounds amazing, but also, incredibly daunting. Where do you even begin with something like that?
Well, it starts with a fundamental shift in the economic paradigm. For too long, Gaza has been under these blockades and restrictions that have just crushed their economy, lifting those restrictions, allowing for goods and services to flow freely. That's essential for any real progress.
But I imagine there are concerns about security, especially from Israel's perspective. How do you balance those concerns with the need for economic development?
It's a delicate balance for sure, but security can't be an excuse for just indefinite economic strangulation. There are ways to address those concerns. International monitoring, cooperation between Israeli and Palestinian security forces, maybe targeted restrictions on certain types of goods. The key is to find solutions that promote both security and development.
Okay, so let's say those hurdles can be overcome. What specific areas should be prioritized for investment?
Well, we need to invest in human capital.
What does that mean?
Education and vocational training are crucial for building a skilled workforce. We need entrepreneurship programs to foster innovation and self-reliance. And we can't forget about healthcare. A healthy population is essential for a productive society.
It sounds like a massive undertaking.
It is.
One that will require a ton of resources. Who's going to pay for all of this?
It's going to require a collective effort from the international community.
Okay.
Donor countries, international organizations, private investors, everyone has a role to play. But it's not just about money. It's about political will, commitment, a shared vision for a better future for Gaza.
It's interesting how this conversation has shifted from focusing on ending the violence to actually building a thriving society. It's almost like we've moved from this mindset of crisis management to one of opportunity.
Yeah, and that's exactly the shift we need to see. It's easy to get caught up in the immediate crisis, but we can't lose sight of the long-term goal.
Which is?
A future where Israelis and Palestinians can coexist peacefully and prosperously.
That's a powerful message. and one that I hope our listeners really take to heart. This entire deep dive has been so eye-opening for me, just in terms of understanding how complex the current situation is, and also trying to imagine what a path towards a more hopeful future might look like.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been great sharing these insights with your audience.
And to all of you listening out there, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Israel-Hamas ceasefire agreement. We've covered a lot of ground: the details of the deal, the potential roadblocks, the historical context, and most importantly, what a truly lasting peace might actually look like. Remember, staying informed is crucial. So keep asking questions, seek out different perspectives, and engage in thoughtful conversations. Because ultimately, peace is something we all have a role in creating.